No, not a bottle of wine, a bottle of water. See how relaxed I am? Yeah, you just. And here, this is, sharp cheese.
I want to cheese.
And we'll eat this tiny bit. No.
That's yours.
Toasty.
Toasted sesame, yes. I like those.
Anyway, I don't know what I'm gonna do with. It's really too hot out there. But then they say they might be coming here, but see, I don't know what they're doing. So, of course, I get, it's just,
Well, the thing is, you want to be, no,
are they really? That's the first class, but you can fly. Boston, Honolulu, Boston. They come, Honolulu, Boston, but cheaper. So much cheaper.
but
That's what my manager said yesterday, don't you wish my mind was using
Hi. Hi. How are you? Good. How are you? What's her show you?
Would you tell me?
she's coming.
I thought that was a check at first, but that's just part of it, he doesn't want to give you the funds.
Okay, so this is the other thing. Gene DeGusky was gonna ask Jane, Joan,
Janet, my wife.
I didn't forget. So that's how you want it.
Yeah.
Library numbers. Check for the scholarship. Yeah. I thought when I started, I didn't even know she's the one, you know, but I don't, no, I don't like it. That's when they got me. We don't.
I thought Clark was doing a little better, like,
Yeah.
he doesn't mind if I have to pay it, you know, what I signed it, yeah.
Funny.
Hey Mary, guess what we just did? Right here. Are you kidding me? Isn't that funny? Awful.
Really good.
And Peg McIntyre, tell her she's
We'll
a
have to go over
nurse.
there.
So
Yeah.
attractive. Yeah, well, maybe you went here or here.
I haven't go over
I probably would know about. He's been with his daughter in Quincy City. He was sitting on this. Oh, I thought he was. Okay. No, she wasn't with Sharon, no, she was with Rosie Brown. Yeah, they were there. No, they're on the other side of the yeah, she was
I was gonna, but then you went by the
It was a whole big group of people, which was kind of a shock to see. Who? Some had a daughter burning.
Yeah, my niece was married, but I played soccer with her.
Her niece.
Anna Kane.
She had three girls. She would know where she was.
I'll give you a check. Okay.
Union Cemetery, Stockbridge, right in an antique house.
I saw that.
She came. No, that's a group I've never seen. Shelley Duffy and Kathy. Either blondish or whitish. Yeah, pretty girl.
Twice a month.
Do they?
I declare and then I'll choose whatever the vote plans, I can pick up plans.
Claire's coming.
But they were there from 8:30 and we met at 11, so they were there quite a while.
I don't think. 11:30. We went to noon. It's a great place to go. Well, you can see you either.
When you walk in the door, she was. Well, I saw
Where the
you.
back is.
I saw you. You know where I saw you? Between that little space in between.
Rosie said to me, check out those big table leaves. See who's there. And because the thing is so tight, you don't hear it. And I'm like, just, I have to talk to him. Just give it.
There we go. Okay. I feel like I'm carrying so much baggage. Oh.
Yeah, and that's all around.
There we go. Should be good. Thank you.
Alan Watts. Heard of Dr. Alan Watts? There's like 30 philosophy, Eastern philosophy. All over YouTube.
Not my thing. I don't like philosophy too much.
You don't have to do it a lot. It's just enough to add into your repertoire. I like it.
Actually, in college, I did take one class. Probably not.
I'm going to focus it a little more so it's bigger.
Oh, okay. Where was it? Oh, so I like the college philosophy.
It is okay, but
Yeah.
it wasn't.
But I don't think I've ever read. Well, if you could say Locke is a philosopher. Well, he was. So I like reading that.
About Terence McKenna.
Don't even know.
He's into the smoking weed.
See, I never did that because I coughed.
He's got some good stuff. He says, we're led by the least among us, the least intelligent, the least noble, the least foresight.
I would say that's, well, except for Lincoln. Well, I gave out the answers to the exam. Oh, okay. Okay, group. Hello, Ollies. Hello. What I have there is a carefully typed card with the names of the people who were either assassinated or an attempt was made on them. And I figured if I said the names, you would probably walk out. So, and I don't even know how to spell them unless I look. The CHs, endless CHs. But in any case, and I'll talk about them. Marina Litvinovich, she was attacked and beaten, but she didn't die, one of the few. And Politkovskaya is one that I had mentioned, and she was probably the best known in the West journalist. And as investigative journalist, Yuri Shishkovshin, he investigated the Baslan, case, and also the theater case. And then Yushchenkov, he got the material on, their scandals, and on the theater scandal, and he gave it to Politkovskaya. He gave the file to her before he was assassinated. So they killed him for nothing. That's why what they wanted to do. And Sobchak was the mayor of Leningrad, who was sent to Kaliningrad and died of a heart attack. He definitely not. And Litvinenko is probably the one you know best, because that got the most attention in the West. And he was poisoned by polonium-210, which is made exclusively in Russia. No one else made it. And this also means that not only it came from Russia, but it had to have been released really from the highest sources. Now,
why not like rat poison, something general, or something more like that? I mean, like you said, it's so obvious.
Because you could probably, most poisons you could save. They go to a hospital, the hospital does intensive care, and they know how to deal with most poisons. Nobody even understood that Litvinenko got the polonium. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. They knew he was poisoned, and his organs were failing, and in the end, they did find out what it was. But it's a surest way of killing someone. So the two, now that he's still in hospital and she's out, that was not polonium. So it was something else. What's it called? Can't think of it now. But it also is made only in Russia. So again, you had to have Novichok, which is kind of a strange sounding. So they also poisoned a former president of Ukraine, and that was, they thought pesticides, but he didn't die. He was severely disfigured, really, he looked awful. So it seems that if they tried to kill him, they would have killed him. But it was just to make it impossible for him to run. Maybe I think that was it. So besides these, there were, and notice the year. It was, Alexander Ditenkov was late, but that's 06. So all these, it was like a rash of murders. Yeah, but I might as well continue on this. Oh yeah, and there was one failed, and what was his? Well, I didn't have him down. Vaxberg, and he was another investigative journalist, and his car was blown up, but he wasn't in it. Lucky dog. And by the way, Politkovskaya there was an attempt to poison her, but again, she didn't die. But she did go in a coma, and it took her ages to recover. And the upshot was that she wasn't able to do what she intended to do, namely cover the Beslan tragedy. So they poisoned her on the flight. And it's interesting, her boss, where is she? Yuri, he was poisoned. And after, he investigated both cases. He was deputy editor of Novaya Gazeta, which was where Politkovskaya worked. So Politkovskaya, when she boarded the plane to go to Beslan, she refused to take any food, but she took tea. And she went into a coma. She came out of it. And let's see, who am I? Well, I already told you about Litvinovich. Litvinovich, she was the one who was severely beaten up, but didn't die. And the police kept telling her that, no, it was, she fell and hurt herself. So all over her body. And then when that didn't work, then they said, well, she was a victim of hit and run. So in all of these, well, no one has ever been found for any of these cases, although some were tried as if, and they clearly weren't the ones. And these were people that definitely was damaging to Putin, but also to others. And so some have argued that, well, there were others who could have done the contract. Well, it's possible, but it's really not likely. For one thing, so massive a count of people that are well known. So besides these, there were several dozen journalists and human rights workers that were killed. You just can't explain in other ways than Putin. Nemtsov, I don't have Nemtsov here because I wanted to show you that period of time. He may well have been assassinated by the head of Chechnya as a kind of thank you note to Putin. And the symbolism would argue that he was assassinated right in front of the Kremlin, so as a gift. And Putin, a couple of weeks after Politkovskaya was killed, went to Dresden, and he met with Angela Merkel, and there was a press conference, and he was asked about her. And basically his response was, but she is of no importance. So, and then he said something like, well, it's terrible, people being killed, but there you go. I want to, I hope I made a note of it. The history of Putin is rather interesting in how he deals with, human lives, I think, would be fair to say. So in this case, after the Chechens held the hostages in the theater, he went to Dresden for a EU-Russia summit. And so, of course, again, you have a press conference. And so a Le Monde journalist, a reporter, asked why the Russian forces were using heavy artillery in Chechnya, because of course it was known that it was mostly civilians being killed, and they were using these massive weapons to do it. So, if you don't mind, I'll read this. It's a bit lengthy, but it's priceless how Putin responded. So there's the question, why are you doing this in Chechnya? If you are ready to become a radical adherent of Islam, and you are ready to be circumcised, what is it, grabbing you know what, or circumcised? Those two people have a thing about, well, you figured out. Okay, circumcised. I invite you to come to Moscow. We are a country of many faiths. We have specialists in this, circumcision. I will recommend that the operation be performed in such a way that nothing will ever grow there again. Priceless. Totally priceless. And that, by the way, is quoted in Masha Gessen that I gave you. Our media did not report this. And one, I think it was maybe the New York Times, said something like that Putin's response was that Russia has many faiths. I mean, they don't recognize a gem when they see it. So, but, and I did see it at the time. He did really say this. Putin is known to be very crude when he deals with something that is, well, objectionable to him. I mean, when I forgot which one of the attacks, one of the early ones in his term, and he was asked about it at a press conference, and he said, well, we're going to go after them and get them wherever they are, in the outhouse or whatever. That's, okay. So maybe I should explain why I'm making such a lengthy presentation of poor Vladimir. Well, there is a reason. And because we're dealing with U.S.-Russia relations, I want to show with this two things. That one, their values, the values that Moscow elites hold, and ours, until recently, are radically different. And they certainly are different as between the Europeans and Russia. So there's that underlying, what should I say, difficulty in that relationship. Even Merkel, who had always been more, I don't know, sympathetic to Putin, considers that, he's living in an alternative universe, and that the values are totally antithetical to the European values and norms. So that is a significant aspect of that relationship. Then when you add other issues, notably Crimea and the meddling in elections, then that really, it damages the relationship almost beyond retrieval, I would say. So that's one point. The other point, though, is that all these killings were going on, and yet the West did not make a major issue of it. There would be sort of, there wouldn't even be as thorough a coverage of this as you might have had. And so if you were not a specialist on Russia, you just weren't noticing that this was happening. Now, I should also say that there were killings in Yeltsin's time, but those were mainly mob killings. And there were two mobs, two mafias. One was Chechen, which was reported to be the most vicious. So when the Russians claim, like Putin has, that, well, the Chechens, they're all criminals. Well, they're not all criminals, but they are major, major criminals when they are. And the other mob was just a regular Russian mob. And they were extorting protection money, and so the killings they engaged in really had to do with that. So Berezovsky, one of the oligarchs, who evidently did actually die of a heart attack in London, possibly. But Berezovsky was threatened, and there were grenades thrown at his, he had a car dealership before he got the TV1, before he became a bigger oligarch. And there was one attack where he was injured, and his driver was decapitated, and his guard lost an eye. It was a major bomb that was thrown at the car. So you had that kind of thing during Yeltsin's time. And so when you have observers saying that, well, there's greater stability with Putin, Putin put an end to that Yeltsin era, well, it seems to be true. So before I go on, do you have any, last time you asked me about Beslan, I think, and I will deal with it in detail. Do you have other things that interest you or you're curious about that possibly I could answer? Maybe not, but if I can.
It's about the maybe it's too far in the future from today, but the civilian airline that was shut down. When I was out in lovely Arizona, my host, not my hostess, my host was a conspiracy theorist who watches a cable Russian channel. You probably do know which one it is. I mentioned that, and he said, oh, the Russians didn't do that.
Yeah, well, I did address that before. The narrative, and that's that thing, Russians have a saying for pil v glazach, throwing dust in your face so that you have no idea what's actually going on. So if the rest of you can put up with a repeat of this, the narrative was, there were several, and that's the pil v glazach. One narrative was, on that TV channel, they showed Putin's plane and the plane that was shot down in profile, silhouette, and they were similar. And so the narrative was that the Ukrainians tried to assassinate Putin and just made a mistake on the plane. But the other narrative, which I thought was more interesting and way more creative, and that was that the Ukrainians and Americans loaded the plane with dead bodies in order to embarrass Russia for killing civilians, So, but yeah, but evidently, but then this story has a more creative, even sort of codex to it, and that is that the bodies, the dead bodies, where did you get? What was it? 200 and how many? Those were the bodies from the airliner that disappeared. See, you couldn't make, but that's what you got on Russian TV, and other things like the narrative that the Ukrainians crucified an 8-year-old boy, and then at another point, they said they crucified a 10-year-old girl. And this was on TV, and people believed it. And there were journalists who went out looking for the slightest evidence, and of course there wasn't any. But there was one journalist, really good, found the woman who talked about it on TV. And she said, well, yeah, of course it didn't happen. But, you know, that's what they told me to say. So, you know, they're in war with Ukraine, and they thought they were doing the right thing. So that's that.
You know, demise, and then Yeltsin comes along, right?
No, not a long time. There were leaders. Brezhnev followed Khrushchev.
About that, the whole country was in demise with the collectivism, and you know, things weren't really rosy there.
No, never. But they weren't in crisis. You know, that came later. When Gorbachev came to power, he actually made a statement on this, that the economic situation of Russia is far more dire than even he knew, right, because their people were creating false statistics to give to leaders. So even Gorbachev didn't know.
And so he was down there in his government was changing around, and there was they wanted to get rid of Gorbachev.
The coup?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was against Gorbachev.
Right. Yeah, but there's a lot of, you know, downward stuff. You know, the people were not having a good time in the, you know, developing wheat and all these things. Didn't really happen.
I don't know.
What didn't happen?
And there wasn't flourishing
Agriculture.
Agriculture was in a lot of mistakes made with that.
Well, indeed. I mean, collectivization was so bad, and this was in you know, the 20s, no, 30s, 20s, 30s. There was some that there was famine in Russia.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying even more recent, Gorbachev and all that.
Yeah, agriculture was never a strong suit. And you mentioned Khrushchev. And Khrushchev tried to reform the system.
Right.
He understood that the problems are severe. And Gorbachev learned from Khrushchev's experience, because Khrushchev tried to do the economic reform because he knew the situation was bad, without changing the political system. So the system knocked him off. You couldn't, people thought that the reforms put their jobs on the line, and so they would have none of it. And Khrushchev was entirely frustrated in his effort. So when Gorbachev started his perestroika, he made sure that he undermined, he got rid of the dinosaurs in the Communist Party who would have opposed, would have been main opponents for reform. And so he had elections, as he figured the dinosaurs were not reelected. So
what gave rise to Putin? You know, was he just a maverick?
Well, not a maverick. It had to do with his history with Sobchak, that he had Sobchak's back, who was about to be tried for corruption. And Yeltsin was impressed with that. And Yeltsin was pushed on him by, well, mainly Berezovsky, who was one of the oligarchs who was very effective, let's put it that way. He was very powerful. And he pushed Putin on Yeltsin, yeah. And then ironically, Putin went after Berezovsky because he considered him a challenge. But Berezovsky was also responsible mainly, there was a group of oligarchs, of re-electing Yeltsin. That was basically a bought election. Isn't this fun? You know, it's very sad that the worse governments and political elites and so on, the worse they behave, the more entertaining it is. I mean, if it wasn't for all those horrible things, what would I have to talk about? I would be teaching you recipes. Maybe not. So what else do you have that you want to yeah.
Else had just returned from Russia, and they were saying, you know, we think it's bad here, but there it's like worse in terms of up being down, and you know, everything was inside out. And they said you just wouldn't even believe what people were saying. And obviously, with everything coming through state TV, they don't have alternative sources in a lot of instances, so they're towing the party line. But the other piece of information, I don't know whether it was them or something I read, was that the economy of Russia is half that of California's, just about half. But because of Putin commanding the stage, that they carry a lot more weight politically than you'd ever imagine, given their economy.
That's a reasonable statement. I don't know. I mean, Russia still is a nuclear power. Russia can do Syria, and they did take Crimea.
That was the point, though, that they're able to do all this stuff and be powerful. But if you just compare their economies.
Oh, well, yeah, but it's good enough. You know, and I think that would be, Russia's economy is generally viewed, including by, you know, your source, as worse than it seems to actually be. Now, and there are many reasons for it, but unquestionably, the two things that have hurt the economy, and those are not permanent things. One is the plunged price for energy, right? Oil and gas. And oil and gas were the major sources for Russia, for, well, hard currency, actually. And the other are the sanctions. And the sanctions, in the long term, probably won't hurt. You know, you brought up the agriculture. Their agriculture is really thriving because they don't have to compete with Europe or the West. And so, for example, one of the things that the sanctions hit, well, they've hit agriculture, but also dairy products. So Russia, which never made reasonable cheese, now has farmers who turn out very reasonable quality cheese. That never happened before, and they wouldn't have been able to do it if Russians could buy, I don't know, camembert from Paris. So they can't, they do their own. And on the whole, I think that's going to be true of a great deal of the economy, not having to compete. So, but that's in the long run. In the short run, it is damaging. And unfortunately, I've looked at various experts, not, you know, terribly deeply, it's not my thing. But as far as I did go, I did not find any sort of good assessment of the damage of the sanctions. So we know there is, but, you know, so it would take quite a lot of time, I think, to go by before we get a better idea. But that's interesting that people do come back with a view of Russia as being in rather poor state.
How put upon we are with sanctions. That's what it's for them.
What are the main causes of the disintegration of the Soviet Union into the blocs that they are? And is there a possibility that there would be an additional revolution within Russia? It seems to me occasionally we see people on the news demonstrating, etc. And there seems to be a group of people who would like to see a revolution within Russia. So the question I have is it in the cards?
Practically one of my favorite topics. That's a very interesting question, because in the West, I think we don't think, there's not going to be an uprising. But Putin is clearly afraid of it. The color revolutions were what he feared. He feared that there would be a contagion. And that's why he was so awful about Hillary Clinton, because he claimed that people went out in the streets after she said the election was dirty, which it was. But he is really concerned. And there are diplomats and others who have come back from conversations with Putin and make that point, that he really drives that home, that the CIA, the West, really wants regime change in Moscow, and he is seriously concerned. So he thinks there could be an overthrow, but I don't think anyone else does.
I mean, with these murders, it's a sign of weakness, I think, not strength. And I think that the people will, at some stage, I think, my sense is it may cause an eruption.
It doesn't. These murders happen. Everybody knew they happened, and nothing changed. Nothing happened. You never forget that Moscow, that the Kremlin controls the media. All but newspapers, smaller newspapers like Novaya Gazeta. If you control the media, it's your narrative that's going to be out there, not, as you.
But no one thought that the Soviet Union would disintegrate.
Good point. How many minutes do you want on that? There are several things. It wasn't, nobody in the streets broke it up. It was really Yeltsin. Yeltsin single-handedly, now we don't know how long the Soviet Union would have lasted if he hadn't taken Russia out of the Union, but he did, and that was it. And because the Baltics, they wanted out, but if they had left, the rest of the Soviet Union would have been just fine. They wouldn't have a beach resort to go to. Latvia has a wonderful Jūrmala, which is, how is it translated? Seashore. And the Russians love to go there, although they love Crimea more. So if the Balts had left, so what? But Yeltsin taking Russia out, well, Russia is the Soviet Union. I mean, that was it. You can't. And he took Ukraine. Ukraine, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Belarus is the smaller puppy in this. But you can't have anything without Russia and without Ukraine, which is also why Putin went after Ukraine when he thought that they might be able to join the EU, because he realized that his project for the CIS and the various organizations would be dead in the water without Ukraine. So that's what really destroyed the Soviet Union. Now, there are deeper causes, and one major factor is that the Soviet Union was a federation, but a very particular federation. It was that the nationalities there were dominant nationalities in each of the republics, or nearly each. And so there was that almost incentive for these units, the republics, to just split. So I would say that if it had not been a federation, I don't see how they would have done the breakup. I mean, that's one of the things that Russia did. Russia took the Republic of Russia out. So it was a unit. That facilitates a breakup. If you have a unitary state, then you do have to have a revolution. Well, there wasn't a revolution in the Soviet Union. And so the coup was against Gorbachev mainly because he presented a new constitution that he wanted a referendum on. And the problem with that constitution, from the point of view of the security forces and the Communist Party, the problem was that he was going to, in the constitution, provide for more autonomy for the republics. And so the coup leaders, 10 of them, I guess it was, considered that that would lead to a breakup. And they were right, but anyhow, that's what the coup was about. That makes sense?
Yeltsin's power and influence vastly diminished at the end?
Yeltsin's?
Yeah.
Well, it evaporated because he was so ill. He was ill. The last speech that he made, he wasn't, you couldn't really understand what he was saying. He was ill. So, and really, I mean, he continued to be president until he resigned, but there were really other people that were influential. And you could see that when Yeltsin would appoint someone as premier, or he'd appoint somebody, and then it would be countermanded, or the man would be changed. And it was said that his daughter was one of the most important individuals, basically manipulating Yeltsin. Anything else, group? I'm so lucky so far. You haven't asked me anything that I didn't know. That's pure luck.
In the paper, different, somebody mentioned this before, different voices, different groups objecting to Putin and demanding revolution and change and all that.
Change, yeah.
And they're not being poisoned. Is it just a matter of time?
Numbers, maybe.
Well, they're dealt with in other ways. I mean, the people that go out to demonstrate, they're actually rather small numbers. And Putin has been able to really control that in various ways, with permits, with police cordons, with traffic manipulation. He's been able to manage all that. But two of the leaders had been poisoned. They were hospitalized. So if you're a leader, yeah, you're under threat. But the larger, they're often jailed. They have mass jailings. Their offices are raided.
They lost a candidate because he was jailed, he couldn't.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Because their constitution does correctly say that you can't run for public office if you've been convicted. So they trumped up charges. So, but I think that's what it is. They manage. And Putin is very resentful of the criticism that comes from, especially the Europeans. We don't seem to notice too much. I think we're busy watching other things. But the Europeans, they do.
They have more to fear. Concerns. It's right over the border. The proximity of it all.
Yeah, and they're concerned about some things more than others. They're very concerned about organized crime. And that, I think, is the really chief reason for them not to have a visa-free regime with Russia, which Putin has been demanding for ever since I think Yeltsin had begun that, and they just won't because of that. Already in Sweden, you have evidently a major Russian mob presence, and evidently in other countries, including in the United States.
They play it up on TV a lot.
Well, they do, but it
The
actually
Russian
is.
mob is the big thing.
Yeah.
Even now.
But they actually are here.
Yeah.
So, you know, somebody found that on Medicare and Medicaid fraud, there's one zip code in America that has the larger number than the whole country put together. And guess what it is?
Brighton Beach.
Brighton Beach. Yeah. Well, it's. I think it's probably majority Russian, right? And so that's.
That's the.
See, I tell you really important things.
To everybody, but I don't know if they figure something about cyber warfare. It's on syllabus. Massachusetts
Indeed. And I was kind of leaving it for the conclusion. No, I'm not leaving it out, but it clearly is there, and I will address that it's not just the United States that has its elections meddled with. It's everywhere. Well, certainly in Europe. And sometimes countries deal with it effectively, notably France. On their election, they simply shut out they shut down vulnerabilities. They found out that their TV station, a major TV network, was attacked, and so now they knew, but they also lucked out. There were technicians that were in the vicinity of the station, and so they flocked into the station and fixed whatever the problem was. So now the French knew that they had that vulnerability, and so they responded effectively. Because much of what happened in the United States was really our fault. You know, the social media and so on. And the French understood that. The French case is the only one I know of where there was a really effective blocking. Well, there was another point that is perhaps more important, and that is that when it appeared that Marine Le Pen, who's the far right, that it appeared that she could win, the rest banded together. In most countries, they don't. You know, they don't form a coalition, but the French did, and that really, I think, saved Macron, because they backed him. Politicians, as I'm sure you know, are loath to form coalitions if they're opposed. So in France, it was the left and the moderates, those who would not want to be together. They did come together, and that's what prevented Marine from being elected.
I saw an interview on some channel during that election in France, and there were a group of young people, not that young, you know, 30s, 40s, that said, yes, we came today, we live in America, we live in the US, but we came just for this election so that we could vote for Macron.
Yeah, that's pretty neat. Yeah. Yeah, you would, right.
Okay. And
right.
they came specifically.
Right. Well, because there was
a group of their friends came.
There was real fear that Marine could be elected.
She was very supportive.
It was a very alarming moment for the French. But as it was, she got the biggest uptick in the support she got of any other election that she had. So she's made major progress from her point of view. And probably it helped that she kicked her father out of the organization. How do you do that? Yeah. So, anything else, or shall I? In Russia.
How can those small anti-media groups, how can they survive?
They hardly can.
It's funny.
They hardly can. And they do, and that's, I would say, why they're really small in number, if you consider.
TV can make it look like numbers, but it's...
Well, there are. I mean, they can get a few thousand out there, but that's not much. Yeah, that's right. And without media coverage, I mean, there are times.
In the country itself, there's no media coverage.
No, they don't even cover the demonstrations. Well, I guess some they do, but yeah, they don't. And without coverage, without having access to the media, talking heads kind of thing, it's very difficult. But they're there. So you do have liberals and Putin, anti-Putin activists and so on. And then some of them are sensational, like Pussy Riot, which got worldwide publicity and allowed me to say that word when I was teaching. There's nothing as much fun as shocking your students, because they didn't know the story, and I came into my Russian foreign policy class and told them about Pussy Riot, and they couldn't believe that I would say such a thing. It's fewer. It's, well, there's, yeah, but in Russia, there's, the last holdout from the Kremlin control was Dosh, which is rain. And then there are I think four others. There's Channel 1, and I don't remember what they call the others. Channel 1 is the one that Berezovsky got control of and then lost. And none of them, well, Dosh was independent for quite a few years and then basically got taken over as well. So that's it. That's it. There's just none.
Is the guy who's Russian, I guess grew up in Brooklyn and then went back to Russia?
Oh.
What's the story on him? Where is he?
Well, you got it. I mean, he was, I think his parents were Russians. I can't think of his name now. But he is, of course, fluent. He speaks American English. He sounds like an American. Because Russians have a very hard time losing the accent. So they will always speak English with a rather heavy accent. So he went back and became kind of a media star. And the West Americans would always turn to him, to his take. And he got a program in Moscow. And he is not a critic of Putin. On the other hand, he doesn't seem to be sort of a radical supporter either. So he is a journalist, but he's more a celebrity. I can't think of his name. Anybody remember his name?
More of the story. Who's living in Brooklyn. Can you tell us more of the story? What did he do?
Well, he was a journalist here too, and he went back when he thought he could go back, I guess. And I think his family, they were all Russian, and I don't remember whether he was born here or in Russia. So that was his connection. And so he presented himself as an expert on Russia, which he is to a point. But but he was able to have those two things, a kind of Western point of view, because he understood America, and Russian point of view, which made him rather effective and very sought after by the Western media. Because if you can speak the language, that's a big plus. But he's not of any particular significance, I don't think, more. Were you going to? No? Okay. So anything else? Okay, then the next theme, and you were segueing to that, I think. I want to address Putin's or Russian grievances against the United States. So you have this relationship that is poor, but there's a particular characteristic about Putin's approach to foreign policy that is determined, this will be familiar to you, determined to show Russia as the victim. Sound familiar? China is ripping us off, et cetera, right? Well, that fascinated me. When I heard Trump using that kind of narratives, I thought, I've heard this before. Putin does that. That is part of virtually every speech he makes that has to do with foreign policy or relations with Europe or relations with the United States. It is a set of grievances that he insists these things were inflicted on not his Russia. He wants to make that point. But when Russia was weak, meaning when Yeltsin was president. And, you might have your own explanation. I don't know what a psychologist would say. There is a psychology to this, why he's so determined to play this victimhood. I've seen some analysts who claim that, well, there's an effort to explain how did Russia end up being in this very bad situation. Putin has called the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. I guess worse than World War I and World War II. But he does say that repeatedly. Well, anyway, I don't know how you would explain why he's so determined to do that. And it's not occasional, it's a constant theme. Yeah.
Wouldn't that have something to do with most dictators that hold a lot of power, even though they have all the power over their people, they constantly have to talk about the enemy.
Well, the enemy is one thing, but to portray yourself as, or your country as a victim is it's a different twist.
Just what Trump does.
That's what I mean.
Blaming it on Hillary, blaming it on Obama, blaming it on this one and that one.
Well, but especially the one that rings most similar to Putin for me is how he deals with China and allies. So China rips us off, right? So it's different from Hillary, and our allies don't put in their fair share into NATO as he wants, and so on. So it's that kind of exaggerated victimhood portrayal. So would you like now to hear Putin's version of victimhood? It is different from Trump's. And as far as I know, Putin did not say, I'm going to make Russia great again. As far as I know. Yeah, no, Unfortunately not. He claims that he's never had any ambition, any interest in recreating the Soviet Union. And that's another thing that he held against Hillary Clinton, because she made a statement to the effect that Putin is trying to do that. And for him, that's a major concern because, well, he is. Not recreate the Soviet Union, but he wants to sort of hold tightly all the republics that left. And the concern for him is that if that narrative gets traction, that he's trying to recreate the Soviet Union, it would create problems for him in his relations with these republics. So he definitely wants the narrative to be anything but that. And so he wants to, what he really wanted to do was to create a grouping of all the former republics, except I don't think he thought he could get the Baltics, and be analogous to the EU, to create this powerful economic entity and so on.
Scope, but separate, not.
Oh no, not part of the EU. Well, at the beginning,
culture. I mean, I think his grievances also have to do with the sad character of Russians who seem to be. When I went there one time a million years ago, you know, when it was in the Soviet Republic, and all the jokes were hard and mean-spirited about people and their drunken characters, and you know, just they feel put upon. I think they're still living with serfs in mind or something.
Okay, I'm not going to go there.
Okay.
I have
That's
a lot
fine.
no, I mean, there is that, but I'm always inclined to be sort of skeptical about character. And, you know,
That's fair.
My experience in Russia was really quite different. Now, I speak Russian, so, well, I speak Russian except when I'm in Latvia. Never, ever. And also, you don't do it in Estonia. I asked directions once in Tallinn, and I asked in Russian because, you know, I don't know Estonian. And she actually pointed me in the opposite direction. And I think that was why. And I've heard that because she just assumed that I was Russian. In English, you mean? Yeah. Yeah, you shouldn't do that. Well, in any case, my experience in Russia, as I say, I did speak Russian, and I'm polite, and which is, you know, American tourists are kind of known for being slightly less than polite. And I was treated very nicely. People wanted to talk to me.
Cousins, and he was there first. He didn't take the cab. You know, it was
Yeah.
gracious.
Yeah. I mean, so I found people to be fine in that way. Yeah, in Latvia, I was staying at the Riga Hotel, which is kind of, I don't know, 1930s or, no, before that. I'm wrong on that, older than that. But anyway, it's sort of charming if there was any building in Moscow, in the Soviet Union that was charming. But when I would go in, I would insist on getting a Latvian to deal with me because I refused to speak Russian and their English wasn't that great. But I wanted them to produce a Latvian.
Yes.
And so I would stand there waiting till they searched. And eventually they would find some, because they dominated what were considered good jobs. And that's the Latvian capital, Riga. Okay, that's enough of my adventures in. So the grievances, right? And if you read Putin's statements, you can see the same list. It's the same set of grievances. So this is a very well rehearsed thing that he holds on to. I just thought of it. I wonder if Trump and Putin sort of get together and share their sets of grievances. Back channels, if indeed. Well, let's look. I'm not going to say that one set of grievances is maybe more significant than another. It depends a little bit on the context. So I will list them for you, and then we can talk about them. So the NATO enlargement, and there were two waves, 1997 and 2004. So the first one was on Yeltsin's watch. And Yeltsin, by the way, initially did not oppose the enlargement. He didn't oppose the Balts, for example, joining. And by the way, Yeltsin was one of the first to recognize Baltic independence. So then later he was attacking them and so on, but initially he wasn't. Anyway, the 2004, of course, occurred on Putin's watch, but there wasn't anything that he could do. He tried to use the Russian minority issue in Estonia and Latvia, and it didn't work. And also the border issue, it didn't work. So he tried, but failed. And that's why it's on his grievance list that the West was able to do this when Russia was not in a position to do anything about it. On the other hand, I don't know what Russia could have done if once the West decided, and it was really Clinton who decided, I mean, he's the most important figure to make that decision. You know that all the NATO members have to agree on any new member. And once the US went for it, then the others agreed, even though like Germany was not really very keen on this. Britain was keen because they kind of wanted to, they always like diluting international organizations. Diluting is sort of better than Brexit, I guess. So anyhow, so enlargement. The second set of grievances had to do with Serbia, former Yugoslavia. So in 1999, it was on Clinton's watch that there was an attack on Serbia, bombing of Serbia, because they were doing ethnic cleansing, and the Europeans had been asking the U.S. to move on Serbia, and Clinton it took him a long time to decide that he would, and then he did. Well, why is this a problem for Moscow? Well, Serbia was considered by Moscow as an ally. So if your ally gets pounded, that is pretty bad. It's bad for your own image, so that's another grievance, again, on Yeltsin's watch. Then a third type of grievance was the 2001 abandonment by Bush of the anti-ballistic missile treaty. The anti-ballistic missile treaty specified that each country can have no more than 3 anti-ballistic missile radars. That's really what they are. And the reason for that, if you think, well, what's wrong with defense, right? What's wrong is that it's understood that if you have a major capacity to defend yourself, then deterrence isn't going to work. So through the whole entire Cold War, the nuclear issue was framed in this deterrence idea, that the way you can best protect yourself is by not attacking the other and vice versa. And how do you prevent the other from attacking you? Well, you promise massive retaliation. So the idea was that if you lobbed a nuke, you're going to get a return nuke. And so that was the deterrent. So if now you somehow acquired the ability to prevent retaliation, you see where that goes? So then you can attack because you can protect yourself against. So deterrence would have been scrapped. Actually, in reality, it wouldn't have been because you couldn't actually protect. But that was the thinking that you should remain vulnerable. Both sides should have that vulnerability to retaliation. That makes deterrence work. And Bush, in his infinite wisdom, decided to scrap that treaty. So from Moscow's point of view, America is going to go for first strike. And first strike is a term of art, meaning you strike and you're safe from retaliation. So it's called first strike capability, meaning you can survive retaliation. Am I boring? This is kind of, yeah, the nuking stuff is boring by nature, I think. All right, now we come to a less boring thing, the color revolutions. Soros was a major actor in supporting the color revolutions, and from Moscow's point of view, there's no difference between Soros, CIA, Washington. It's all one basket. That it's really the West. And so what were the color revolutions? Well, there was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and it had to do with the color of the banners, right? There was the Tulip Revolution in Georgia. No, that was rose. And one of the stands was the tulip. In any case, the point is that in each case there were dirty elections, people went out in the streets demonstrating, and they had a chance to have another election because there was a regime change. So that's what it was about. The color revolutions were taken as Western efforts at regime change. In every case of the dirty election, the one who won was pro-Moscow, and the one who won after the revolution was pro-West. And it was most stark in the case of Ukraine. So for Moscow, this was a major grievance, not only because the West was involved from his point of view on its doorstep, but also because, as I said before, Putin was concerned that we're plotting to do a color revolution in Russia. And at one of those demonstrations, people were wearing white ribbons. Oh yeah, that reminds me, Putin, with his usual love of smutty stuff, he was quoted as saying that, well, those aren't really white ribbons, they're condoms. You kind of have to wonder how his mind sort of works, or short circuits, I don't know which. Yeah, Sounds familiar. Anyhow, so color revolutions had that dual problem. The West interfering in what Moscow considers as its special space of interest or sphere of influence, and that it was represented a threat to Moscow. Gee, I'm so graceful. That it represented a threat to him, to his group. And the revolutions, the color revolutions that were most significant was, as I said, Ukraine and Georgia. And the reason those were particularly significant was because both had wanted to join the EU and NATO. And that was, and actually, I don't think either one really had a chance, but we kept saying, we, the West, there was a phrase that was always used, the door is always open. So, anybody who qualifies could join. But actually, it could never happen with Ukraine because the Ukrainians themselves were divided down the middle. Those who wanted to join and those who would want to be with Moscow. And NATO could never accept a member that is divided on that issue. And Georgia was a problem because of what are called frozen conflicts. South Ossetia, so South Ossetia is this area in Georgia which borders North Ossetia. Ossetians were a distinct people ethnically. They're not Russian or Georgian. But in any case, they're split. And well, there's also Abkhazia, another enclave, which is sort of further west. So I don't see how NATO could have taken either one, but Putin wanted to make sure that they didn't. So the color revolutions were just particularly significant there, including because Ukraine is a major, it's the second most important country in the Soviet Union and today in the region. Then, and where am I? For the fifth grievance was the idea, and this was Bush, the shrub, not the father. Bush proposed, he made an agreement with Poland and the Czech Republic to have those missile defense bases. And the administration argued that they're doing it, they need it against rogue states like Iran, because they're going to get missiles, well, they have the missiles, and who else? Well, whomever. Well, not Pakistan, at least they didn't say it, but Iran, they said. And so Moscow said, what? This is aimed at us. And I have to confess that I don't know the technical truth on it, because at the time that it was rather hotly debated, there would be those that said, well, this can't be used against Moscow. And there were others that said, well, yeah, they could. And so you're on your own for that. But what is not debatable is that Moscow was convinced that it was really aimed at them. And this was, on their doorstep. And it's a further humiliation that they can't control. Now, these countries were part of NATO, and so from the American point of view, they could do that. But for Moscow, again, it was not just a security issue, but it was also a power issue that once again drove home the idea that Moscow is, well, a sick puppy. And Obama, when Obama became president, he suspended that agreement. And I haven't heard Trump say anything about it. So I think it's indefinitely suspended. And I should say that Poland and the Czech Republic were bitterly disappointed about this. And the reason is not so much that they wanted these bases, but rather that they paid the political price of having them. It costs them because their people didn't want these bases, right? It was an unpopular idea.
How could Obama stop it?
Well, because Bush made the agreement with Poland and the Czech Republic, so Obama simply revoked the agreement. Yeah. Yeah, so that politically that was very costly for Poland and the Czech Republic. I mean, the people were pleased that they weren't going to be there, but the leaders paid a price for having it in the first place. The lesson is don't do what your allies ask you. So Bush didn't so much ask, I think, as really pushed. And I should also say that the leadership in Poland and the Czech Republic, but more in Poland than in the Czech case, were very suspicious of Moscow. And so for Poland, for the leadership, that seemed like a pretty good idea. So, and the last grievance. See, if we do this too long, you could really get depressed. I mean, such a long list. So the last is, or the most recent, maybe that's why I should put, was Kosovo in 2008. So Kosovo was part of Serbia. You know, Yugoslavia was a federation, and it too, as the Soviet Union, it broke up into the republics. But Kosovo was at one point an autonomous area within Serbia, within the Serb Republic. And when Milosevic came to power, he abrogated Kosovo's autonomy. He really reined it in, and that caused the uprising and so on and so forth. And there was conflict and ethnic cleansing and those things that Yugoslavia kept falling into. The West intervened, and they set up a situation where the Serbs were kept out of Kosovo, except for one area where in the north there's a Serb majority. So it's within Kosovo, but it's Serb, and they've never stopped fighting over it. But in any case, keep in mind again that Serbia is Moscow's ally. And of course, Serbia was adamantly opposed to an independent Kosovo. And what does the West do? Okay, you can be independent. And so that was a slap at Moscow, because they adamantly opposed it. And it's very interesting. Putin said, if you recognize, if you support Kosovo's independence, I'm going to do the same with South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And he did. And whenever that is mentioned, see, Putin is a man of verbal habit. They never forget to say, but you did it in Kosovo. One thing, they're consistent. They're very. So that was, again, a major grievance. And by the way, if you have seen the photos of Kosovars wrapped in the American flag, it has to do with that. Because the United States was the one that was strongest on it. The Europeans agreed, but am I doing that? So you can see that these are major issues. And so from Putin's point of view, it's not that we did all these things, but that we totally ignored Moscow's preferences. And Moscow found itself really unable to do anything about it. Not that I think there was anything they could have, given the circumstances. But that's Putin's everlasting grievance. You know, can you think of what it would be like to be married to a guy like that, who nurtures grievances and never forgets them? That's a thought, right? Putin? He is. He divorced his wife, or she divorced him, whichever. No, Raisa was Gorbachev's wife, and she died, and I don't believe Gorbachev remarried, but Putin did. He married a gymnast. That must be interesting. A gymnast. So what do you think, group? Serbia. No, Milosevic was the head of Serbia. Yeah, so he was an ally. He's the one that went on trial in Hague, crimes against humanity, right? And he died in jail. Well, yeah. Well, he was married to a woman who had the most extraordinary pileup of hair. That explains everything. And she left him, so he's in jail. She went to Moscow to live. Google her, see if she's still got her hair. Oh yeah, I heard that. Yeah. So what do you think, group?
Very good. Bunch of assholes.
It is interesting. But you see why I like teaching, right? Because this stuff is fascinating. Exactly. You know, as I used to tell my classes, that studying politics is the most fun you can have with your clothes on. That was probably a Trumpian joke. Now, the books, where is my list? I don't know. But if you look on your syllabus, so the, where is it? Yeah, Lilia Shevstova, I just want to remind you that her take, especially if you read the book on Yeltsin, then the one on Putin, she's really one of the most insightful on mostly what I'm dealing with, although, well, I should say, her take on this list of grievances and other things as well. Shestova argues that what has befallen Russia is really self-inflicted. So she has a slightly different take on this than I do, but she has a point that and she especially sees that as true for Putin, that it's self-inflicted. Yeah, well, and again, I want to remind you that Singanko's book is totally opposite from what I do. I mean, he's very supportive of Putin and Russia. Well, I thought I should tell you. How many of you are reading those? You are? What did you read?
I'm reading the Readings in American Foreign Policy because it's current and it.
Yeah, that's very good and gives you a comprehensive. It's not just about Russia. Yeah, that's a good.
I looked at Chetnova and
Chechnya?
Yeah, and she writes very well.
Yeah.
I didn't get it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one thing. I try to pick things that are readable and yeah. The Alexei Maloshenko is the fight for influence. That's very good on the idea of, Putin trying to recreate the Soviet Union, but not. And it's a good narrative. It's a good account, and it's relatively up to date. They published it in 2013. So what I'm going to do next time, this session is almost over. So next time I will have a conclusion. And I'm going to try to sort of pursue the main themes in Russian policy and ours. We don't have any main themes. That's one of the things that afflict the relationship, where Moscow is so focused on the West and the United States in particular. And so there are loads of themes that are there, but we don't focus on Russia. And if you recall, when Romney said that Russia is the biggest threat, everybody giggled. It didn't seem at all. See, I would never giggle about someone who tied up their dog on top of their car. I just wouldn't do it. No, he sticks his dogs on Angela Merkel.
That's right.
You know that he had, Angela Merkel was known to be afraid of dogs. And so when she was waiting to be shown into Putin's office, he had his dog, which is a huge dog, in the room where she was.
Yeah. Nasty.
Well, she is very good indeed. That too. Paul, that's, yeah. Well, would anyone like the last word?
No.
Well then, see you next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Bye, Hegel.
Bye. Thank you.